who is coming into South America? And tied to that question, how will that affect the political systems in that country, in those countries? You spoke about the connection between the economic system and the political systems. Is the entry of China or other countries, could that endanger liberalization in those countries as well?
Well, to your first question, the reason why the American share of foreign trade in Latin America is now, in South America particularly, is now smaller than before, is of course because of the emergence of competing economies that are demanding large quantities of Latin American exports, and particularly China. Latin America is still a resource-rich region, and China has been enormously active in the region. Indeed, the current Chinese president has spent more time in Latin America than the last 3 presidents of the United States combined. And the effect has been a rapid rise in raw materials exports to China, some manufactured goods, but less. So the one principal reason why the United States is less important in the region is because China is more important. But if you add to that the rate of growth of exports to the European Union, to South Korea, even to India and other parts of South and East Asia, the relative size of the United States share of Latin American trade has simply shrunk. And I think, take your second question, that does have considerable political implications for the region because it allows Latin Americans to do, particularly those in South America, to do what they've always wanted to do and have tried, but not very successfully for the last 100 years, and that is to balance other interests off against those of the dominant power in the region. And they will do that with increasing success, I think, over the next decade.
Just to add to that, I think it's also important to say that there's going to be new leadership, and already has been new leadership regionally within Latin America. So I've been working for 3 different central banks in Latin America and South America lately especially. One of the things that I'm noticing is the enormous progress in institution building within what I would call the leading countries in South America. And I would point to Colombia, Chile, and of course Brazil as those 3. And they're not just improving their own situations, they're also providing leadership for their neighbors. The Chileans, for example, have been the most successful economy in the world in structuring prudential regulation of financial system. They regularly advise other Latin American countries. The Brazilians and the Chileans have been among the most successful in inflation targeting. And by the way, the Chileans have finally figured out that fiscal policy should be countercyclical relative to copper prices, and have been managing it very well. The financial crisis in Brazil was managed extremely well. The financial crisis in Colombia was managed better than in any country in the world, and their central bank president is a national hero as a result. So if you look at leadership within Latin America and the question of influence, we shouldn't presume that it's just a question of the U.S. is going out, who's coming in? Who's coming in is who's already there, which is Brazil, Chile, Colombia. And the other thing that's especially encouraging about that, not just all the great, I've got a long list of good institution building in Latin America we could talk about, but also from the standpoint of redefining what the meaning of the Latin American left is. That has been completely redefined by Lula. We don't know yet whether it's going to be a long-term redefinition. My guess is it is. And that has, despite the fact that we still have these sort of antediluvian populists in Venezuela and Argentina, they're on the way out. And I think that this kind of internal leadership in the region is extremely, making me at least extremely optimistic. If I can connect it, my own view is that there's a consensus coming out of this discussion, actually, which is, despite the fact, and I speak for myself, but I think I'm hearing similar things, despite the fact that growth globally is likely to be fairly slow for the near term, mainly because of the drags coming from Japan, Europe, and the United States right now, that there's some very good longer-term trends that are happening globally that are laying the foundations for very good long-term growth. And I would put them in three categories. One of them is good institution building. We're seeing that in Latin America. Of course, we're seeing it in India. We're hopeful that we're going to see the continuation of it in China. It's, I would say, stalled right now, but I think we have good reason to believe it. Arvind hit another very important point, which is migration. Now, Latin America, of course, is used to the idea of migration up north. But when I was in Japan a few years ago, which is struggling with a demographic crisis, they were actually seriously contemplating, and of course Japan is the most insular culture on the face of the earth. They were seriously describing the possibility that they could go to India to help resolve some of their demographic problems. Why? Well, there's a core of highly educated people in India. They speak English, and they're trained in areas that the Japanese find interesting. And of course, there's a lot of young people. So it's quite interesting to think another very optimistic thing is not only is the world going to be more polycentric, as we've all been saying, more interconnected, but migration, which will allow people to really get to know each other, is a very potentially positive influence. So thinking beyond where does growth come from? Growth comes from peace. Prosperity is related to peace, understanding, building good institutions. So I think that if I maybe came off a little pessimistic, I am pessimistic about the near term. But I think that the themes that we're hearing here are very real in terms of better institution building, more of a polycentric and integrated world, and also migration patterns that will lay foundations for more direct person-to-person connection. And that's not something we've really had before. So the world really is going to be different.
I think institutionally you want to add the fact, the obvious one, which is that the world today is far more democratic, I mean incredibly so, than even 25 years ago.
Absolutely.
The counterpoint to that is, of course, China.
Even China is opened up quite a bit compared to where we were. So if you look 25 years ago, it is still, even China is much more open today.
I wanted to ask Shangjin and Arvind, the two main difficulties that your respective countries of interest face are perhaps democratization in China and infrastructure in India. Can you sketch out a plan in the near term how these two countries can face these problems? Maybe not solve them entirely, but how can they begin to move in a direction of a resolution that doesn't involve a complete crisis?
In order to looking ahead intelligently, one needs to also look back wisely. I think that you think about democracy, you should not think of this as a one-dimensional object. It's not just about ability for the populace to elect the top leadership. Once you think of that way, there's actually democracy and civil rights, civil liberty is a vector with many, many attributes. Once you think of that way, this is what Arvind was hinting at. In fact, even China, there has been a very steady and substantive expansion of personal freedom and civil liberties. So, for example, 30 years ago, a typical person, China was like a Stalinist central planned economy and Stalinist polity. A given person went to a school he or she was assigned to, graduated and went to work for a company he or she was assigned to, live in an apartment he or she was assigned to, get a wage which was pitiful wage, and had very little freedom. Today, in very genuine sense, China is fundamentally a market-based economy. Supply and demand decides most of things. Most people decide, what to wear, where to go to work, and so on and so forth. Right? So these are civil liberties that arguably for the average person is more important than the ability to elect the president. In that sense, right? So China is not full democracy, no question about it, and a long way to go. But it's not frozen. The Chinese political state is not frozen in the last 30 years. In many, many concrete sense, the country has been more democratized. Certainly people's the range of civil liberty has expanded greatly. China today is very different, not just in economic sense, but in political rights, it's different from 30 years ago. This allows one to have hope that looking ahead, you'll see continuing expansion in many dimensions. And of course, history also tells us when the final stage of democracy comes. There are two things one should. History gives us some suggestions, some hints. One is they tend to come. That as the economy develops, you see those comes. Countries the U.S. call allies, South Korea and Taiwan, were not democracies when U.S. decided to have them as allies. And as the economy develops, something changes. So even though so that's one. The other is when this comes, history also tells us that its exact timing is very difficult to forecast beforehand.
Arvind?
Yeah, no, infrastructure, largely I'm quite optimistic. Here is one example, telecommunications. In 1991, after about 110 years, telephone came very early to India in the early 1880s. There were about 5 million telephones in 1991. Currently, India has been adding about 17 million per month, not per year, but 17 million per year, per month. Likewise, roads. I think it's a bit slower, but 15 years ago, I thought India will never be able to build roads like the United States. But there are several highways now which are quite comparable. In fact, there is a whole golden quadrilateral that has been built up. So, airports. Again, if you go to Delhi, the newest airport, T3, as it is called, the Terminal 3, is incredibly state-of-the-art. So airports also there. So roads, they've learned to build. Airports, they've learned to build. It's a bit slower. Seaports also, great progress. I'm sort of optimistic that will happen over the next 10 to 15 years. The big question mark within infrastructure that I have for India is the electricity and power. I think that's where somehow India has not figured how to crack that nut. And that's where I kind of tend to be a bit pessimistic as to how this problem is going to be resolved. There is not enough resolve. Well, lots of problems. One being that this is a state issue. Every state has to solve this electricity problem. It's not, whereas telecommunications is completely federal, and so the reform was a bit easier. Electricity is a harder one. And India's electricity problems are much tougher. Today, easily, about 40% of the rural households don't even have an electricity connection, let alone have electricity or have access to the use of electricity. So it's a pretty serious matter. So that's where I get worried. If I may just slip in here one kind of related issue, which I think going forward for India is going to be the biggest one, is that typically when countries grow rapidly, when labor-abundant countries as India is, and they are at the early stages of development as India is, if you look at China, Korea, Taiwan, even the earlier history of the industrialized countries, typically employment, the workers get pulled out of agriculture into industry. And that transition happens not purely in terms of output, but also employment, that a lot of the workers, basically agriculture shrinks both in terms of output share as well as employment share. India has had the problem actually that the employment share of agriculture has declined very little. Industry has not grown very rapidly. In fact, the share of industry and manufacturing both has remained more or less constant in the last 20 years. As a result of which, what you observe is that the share of output of agriculture has declined, so it's about less than 20%. Share of employment share still remains about 55%. So you've got very large amount of this workforce sitting or earning its income from very small, relying on a very small part of the income. And this is going forward going to be a serious problem. It requires a lot of the reforms in the labor markets, which would allow the industry, manufacturing in particular, to actually grow more rapidly. I don't see that happening in the next 3 or 4 years until there is a new government which is more determined and more willing to carry out that reform. I kind of remain a little bit pessimistic. That's where I really see the bigger problem.
I wondered if any of you would care to speculate on whether we could see a meaningful climate change agreement in the next 10 years. Copenhagen ended in sort of muddled confusedness, and Charles, you were talking about how it's been Europe's issue in some ways, but at a time when now that Europe is in economic crisis, is this something they can really lead on?
Europe has never managed to, hasn't been really called to fulfill any of these mandates. And given their success on fulfilling their own fiscal mandates internally, I would say that we probably shouldn't be relying on Europe to lead the way to show us how to fulfill environmental mandates. But one comment I can't resist making about India in this regard is that, and I learned this, experienced similar things in Africa, a large part of the problem here is not whether energy should expand, but whether energy should be allowed to become efficient. And if you really had a grid properly structured and regulated in India or in Africa, I don't think that you would need to have quite the same environmental impact. After all, diesel-burning generators for individuals are hugely wasteful. And so there is a kind of good institutional solutions for building a proper grid are going to be both growth-oriented and friendly to the environment. But I think your point, though, is well taken. It's too much to expect India, Brazil, China, other countries that now view it as their turn to grow, to think that they're going to hold back. And I'm much more of the mind that we have to be thinking of alternatives to restricting emissions for those countries, and I think there are other alternatives. So but I think we have to be thinking, it's not just a question of more growth means more energy. If you could improve the efficiency in India and, of course, in Africa as well, you could have a lot of growth on a proper grid.
Just joining Charlie a little bit, I think, yeah, I mean, there is huge scope for efficiency improvements. There's no doubt in India, the what we call the T&D losses, these are the losses along the transmission grid, but also distribution grid. Also free provision of electricity to the farmers, which means no economy in the use of electricity. So it's a huge amount of scope, there's no question. Although I still think that India will need to expand its total, so we agree on that. And the broader thing, I agreed with Charlie totally that in the end, no matter how much noise the Europeans make, in the end, unless the US provides the leadership, I don't think much will happen on the climate change treaty internationally and so forth. And unfortunately, I think right now, I just don't see that the U.S. actually being in a position to provide that leadership, because the U.S. is now not going to go in and push for an agreement, a binding agreement internationally, until U.S. has something in place domestically. Because this was a problem in the Kyoto Protocol, that the U.S. kind of signed the agreement and found that it couldn't actually get it through the Senate here. And so, in the end, the lesson of that was that, look, first get the domestic house in order, first have some sort of, so Waxman-Markey was an attempt in that direction, but that didn't go anywhere, and I don't think anything else is going to go anywhere in the Congress currently. So I personally think that, internationally, not a whole lot is going to happen, certainly not in terms of binding agreement. We might have a goodwill kind of agreement where everybody makes an effort. There's no question that the countries, including the developing countries, do see that this is a serious issue. And so they want to do it. But I don't think it will happen through a binding agreement.
On this topic, what kind of U.S. leadership do we want? Well, this comes back to what are the sources of problems for not reaching the international agreement. Right? So there are essentially two, right? So one is often portrayed in the media and here that leading emerging markets, China, India, often singled out in their context, are resisting international agreement. They're resisting to making enough sacrifice on their front. So that's why the international agreement is not reached. But that's only part of the story. Of course, the world as a whole is facing a problem that we have too high a stock of CO2 emission and other less desirable stuff. The too high stock doesn't just come from new emissions from current fast-growing economy. Of course, the countries that have already industrialized cumulatively have contributed a lot more than than the new high-growing economy. This is not about assigning blame, but this is about the nature of the problem. The nature of the problem is that you need both legs for this table to work, two-leg table. That you need emerging markets to willing to cut down emissions, and you need countries that have already reached high enough income to own up to their historical responsibilities. Right? And one way to do this is a grand bargain, that you have to have a super fund, that countries that have benefited so much from freely drawing resources from the atmosphere to contribute to the super fund, and have the super fund to provide compensation to emerging markets in return for them to adopt newer technologies, different technologies that may be more costly to them, but good for the world. If the high-income countries that have already benefited from freely exploiting the resources can pay for this, at least partially, they could induce this. The current, the last negotiation round is set up in such a way that U.S. negotiator went to the negotiating room. It's announced outset, if there's anything that resembles superfund, China has to be excluded. Right? So the ostensible reason is China's going pretty fast. They have a lot of money. Why don't you need that? But I imagine the hidden reasons. China's in China, so we don't want to. If we can't have any excuse to exclude China, we'll do that. But this creates a problem. So I think they make it China, India less willing to do what they need to do to contribute to the problem. I think a grand bargain is needed. If there's a super fund, eligibility should be based on income, basically, right? So income level and therefore, the world as a whole has to have a cap on CO2 emission and the rate of the new emission. And the distribution of a cap has to take into account both the current contribution to the problem and historical contributions. And I think a deal potentially can be struck. And U.S. leadership is needed there to ensure that the super fund can be set up, and that other countries could contribute in a fair way to this joint global public good.
Charlie, you want to?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing which I think will be provocative for others, which is one of the things that is strange about the current global world order, if you want to call it that, is all of these optimistic things we're talking about started in individual countries, have had to do with voluntary partnerships and trade and other connections among countries. But if you look at our multilateral institutions, they're not ill-suited right now. I mean, they're not well-suited to addressing this problem and many other problems. So let's just do a little quick survey. The United Nations, can anything be more broken than the United Nations right now? In my view, a completely broken organization, hard to even know exactly how to fix it and make it effective in any way. The World Bank and the IMF, still heavily tilted toward a post-World War II sort of allocation of power, which doesn't really fit a world in which China and India and Brazil and maybe at some point Russia might become really much more dominant. And it doesn't look like the G7 is so excited about becoming really fully engaged in sharing that power in those organizations. Those organizations, I would say, still operate as largely slush funds for the G7. So how exactly do we create these arrangements that Cheng Jin is talking about that might, in some sense, recognize the more polycentric world that we live in? Is very hard to imagine, and I'm not optimistic about it, and I'm not even sure that it's an entirely good idea to try. So I'm a little pessimistic about the ability of global organizations to emerge, and I don't think the ones we've got are very effective.
On the grand bargain, it seems to me perfectly feasible as long as the Chinese loan us the money that we have to give them in order to make their improvements. On the issue of international organizations, I tend to agree with what Charlie said, although I think if you look at each of them, each of the three he's mentioned, you'll notice changes and adjustments that have been slow in coming, slower than we needed, but which are beginning to have some impact. I think the expansion of UN global peacekeeping operations during the period of Kofi Annan and to the present has had some notable successes in parts of the world. 10 years ago, the UN had barely 30,000 troops around the world. Now it has 130,000, and there are many areas in which it is the only feasible or viable representative of the international community. So, and that's especially true in Africa. The IMF was surprised and not particularly effective in its initial responses to the financial crisis, but has now begun to create special lending authorities and to act more like what you would expect a central bank to do within a country, that is, to supply liquidity when it's necessary and to do the things that a financial crisis requires a kind of global central bank to do. Not well, not quickly, and not enough, but it's moving in that direction. And the World Bank has been making, more slowly than one would hope, changes in its policies as well. So my own sense is that we don't have global economic governance right in any sense. We're much too far behind. But there are opportunities for the institutions we do have to evolve in ways that will make them much more effective in the future. And the learning experience of these last 3 years has had a tremendous impact on all of the organizations that Charlie's mentioned. I think especially the IMF.
My 2 cents worth, I would add on to the World Trade Organization. I think that is an organization that is working reasonably well. Doha Round is not moving, but that doesn't mean that the system is not working. The multilateral trading system is doing quite well, actually.
I agree with you. And in fact, it's surprising, given all the stresses that we've already had in this crisis,
how little
that it hasn't come apart.
Yeah.
And I think that, but I would also say that that is largely a unilateral, an organization that depends on willing unilateral actions by governments. And so the kinds of arrangements
it is backed up by self-interest.
That's what I'm saying.
If the U.S. tries to kind of go protectionist way, it faces China's and India's and all the Europeans to retaliate. So it's a system which has checks and balances within it. And generally countries have kind of been good guys. I mean, they've tried to play by the rules.
I want to clarify what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we're not able to develop effective organizations like the WTO that depends on self-interest to make it work. My point is to come up with the kinds of grand bargains that Cheng Jin's talking about are going to be hard. And while I agree with John that the last few years we've seen a lot of learning about what's wrong with some of these multilateral institutions, we've started to see some cracks in some of the ossified views there. Still, when I look at what the IMF just participated in doing to Ireland and what they are trying to do to Spain, at the behest of the core countries in Western Europe, just throw Ireland under the bus and throw Spain under the bus. I think it's still very much a club of France and Germany and the United States and Britain, and I think that the IMF has a long way to go, although I'm happy the commission I served in 2000 that recommended the new lending facility that the IMF finally has developed, I see as a step forward. But let's also note that Asia decided that it couldn't rely on the IMF and that they've created their own self-insurance through the accumulation of massive reserves, and that to the extent that there's been stability in Asia, we can't thank the IMF for that. So
Latin America took the same approach.
And of course Brazil had 20% of their bank assets in the form of liquidity, which is how they managed to support themselves. So I would say that my own model is more consistent with where I see the world going, which is enlightened self-interest of competing sovereign states being really the secret for expansion of trade and financial stability.
It is always about self-interest. The grand bargaining in climate cooperation across country is consistent with self-interest of the U.S. and China. They need some country to take the leadership, politicians to take the leadership to convince constituencies within respective countries that is consistent with self-interest.
Yeah. I mean, also it seems, maybe it'll have to get a little worse before it gets better in these terms. That still, I think we're not seeing the danger staring us in the face, and so, people are willing to step back and say, let's wait and see. But in the end, I think something along the lines of a fund will have to be done, because ultimately it doesn't seem to me that there is a pure mitigation strategy that is workable. You need technological change. You really need alternative sources of energy to become cost effective. Because you see, if it was possible to do mitigation at the scale that that is actually required, something would have happened. But it is so costly to mitigate. Certainly, you see Europe, you see United States, very little mitigation. I mean, whatever mitigation has happened is because Eastern Europe actually had very high quotas effectively under the Kyoto, and they then declined in the 1990s. So that released a lot of the slack actually for the Europeans, so they can claim to actually have done the Kyoto Protocol or nearly done the Kyoto Protocol, but really no actual mitigation has happened. And it's simply, if you talk to the companies, you talk to those who have to do it, it's so extremely costly. And so there has to be a set of technological breakthroughs, both in terms of the mitigation technologies as well as greener sources of energy. And I think ultimately that is where, therefore, the fund will have to be someday set up.
It seems the point that we're getting across is that states can work together on short-term aspects of immediate gain. They have a harder time on longer-term projects. I think you saw that right during the financial crisis. There were packages that the G20, the G8, and the G20 set up together. Does the G20 have a role to play here? Can that organization help the world economy and these countries work together better, or is that too broad an organization?
Oh, I want to talk about that because I was in Cyprus for a conference, and the Finnish representative to the ECB was giving a speech along with 4 of his other colleagues from the ECB board. And he was complaining very much that the G20 was taking on the role of managing the IMF. He has a little problem with that because Finland's not a member of the G20, but Finland does pay for IMF assistance. And so I thought it was a very interesting speech that he gave about the problem of when you don't have a UN that's effective, that can really operate, because the number is too big, it's too diffuse, and too hypocritical, I would say. You need something bigger than the G20, though. That's the problem. Because there are a lot of countries that want to have a voice in some of these decisions, and the G20 is too small. And that creates extremely bad feelings for countries like Finland.
But on that count, though, then Europeans should also be willing to relinquish some of their extra quotas in the IMF.
Agreed.
I mean, ultimately, even small little countries from Europe have very large quotas compared to some of the other developing countries. And so, I mean, the biggest problem in reallocating these quotas has been the fact that the Europeans have been so reluctant to actually let their quotas go down. But
just to make the debate lively, I would take the opposite position that G20 maybe is a bit too large.
Something.
When G7 was managing the IMF and world economy, Finland was not a member of the G7. They didn't really get to say very much. G20 does represent an improvement over G7 because G7 simply does not have enough legitimacy and does not accurately reflect a big chunk of the world. And sometimes they got ideas wrong. And when they got ideas wrong, they can have disastrous consequences. By the way, as a trivial fact, G20 is a group of 19 systematically important countries, plus something else. So not many people know this. If you don't learn one thing tonight, it's this. G20 is not a collection of 20 countries. It's 19 countries plus European Union.
That's right.
But on a more serious topic of governance, right? So the hope is when your large, fast-growing emerging markets get a seat on the table, if there's a good case to be made that country experience does inform one's view about policies and domestic policies, international assistance policies, and so on, it might improve the quality of advice. There's certainly hope for that. At the same time, it's not automatic. Just having China, India at a seat at the table, you get higher quality of things. Right? So Chinese central bank governor very frankly said, apparently he wasn't thinking through about the ramification, that he said, now we have a seat. What do we really want? He was saying he wasn't sure, but I think that represents the entire leadership wasn't exactly sure what they want. But the structure is there. That potentially you get more diversity of views. That therefore something that people who are trained in North American universities or coming from G7 governments don't automatically think about. Now other people will think about it and have a voice, and it could improve the quality of the discussion in global policy. That certainly is the hope.